Three groups imagined the future for Black Americans: the Republican Party in Congress, Southern whites, and freed slaves themselves. Lincoln's political party, the Republicans, were a market-oriented party. Thomas Jefferson articulated the agrarian idea of freedom. Freedom is based on economic independence, which for him was based on ownership of land. This ideal was never achieved in the U.S., but it was widely believed, and the region with the highest rate of land ownership in 1860 was the upcountry non-slave South. This need for economic power and land ownership was seen in the petition to President Johnson by the freedmen that you read in Voices of Freedom for this week. Republican conceptions of the market, by contrast, were based on the idea that the market is something you enter of your own free will, and where you have control over your actions. Freedom derived from this choice. So Republicans in Congress believed that to the extent that people can enter into contractual relationships, they are free. To the extent that they cannot, they are slaves. Emancipation ends buying and selling of human beings, but freedom is now defined in terms of buying and selling labor. So after the Civil War, we see a switch from the idea of freedom is based in land ownership to one in which freedom is based in your ability to sell your own labor to whomever you wish. Now, free people are those who can sell their labor or buy the labor of others. So Reconstruction happens in two parts, and the first of those is presidential Reconstruction, which I'm going to talk about first. So Lincoln had sketched out a plan for readmitting states to the Union known as the 10% Plan. Andrew Johnson followed this plan. Under the 10% Plan, when 10% of Southerners, aside from a long list of those who had been excluded, took an oath of loyalty, the state could come back to the Union. So only 10% of the people of the Southern Confederates, former Confederates in that state, had to take an oath of loyalty to the Union, then the entire state could be readmitted. Almost all of the confiscated property was returned. No Southerners were forced into exile, and Johnson pardons over 13,000 Confederates and allows these people back into politics and public life. Southerners' civil rights overall are very quickly restored. For Southern whites, they were not satisfied with the lenient measures granted to them under presidential Reconstruction. They often responded with violence. In fact, there we go. There was incredible violence against ex-slaves. Whites lashed out at blacks and whites who assisted them in resisting white dominance. In 1866, the Ku Klux Klan formed in Tennessee. From 1865 to 1868, more than 1,000 murders of blacks took place by whites in Texas alone. There were 500 indictments and no convictions. Northerners feared that the South would reestablish slavery. New Southern governments refused to acknowledge and recognize that slavery was really gone for good, and there's talk of reinstating slavery. These states begin to pass black codes, which you can see here. This is from the Mississippi Black Codes, which you read some of in Voices of Freedom, beginning in the summer of 1865. So all 7 states that were readmitted under President Johnson's liberal plan imposed these codes. They are an American apartheid. They define African Americans as agricultural employees who can't do anything else. If an African American is found without labor, he or she can be fined or hired out to a plantation. Blacks need passes to enter towns. Black children can be taken from their parents and given to whites until they turn 21. So these are very strict, and they're passed, like I said, in all 7 states that were readmitted into the Union. And I want you to take a look at that document in Voices of Freedom, because there are, as you can see, penalties not only for freed people, but also for whites who try to assist them. And I want you to take a look at what crime was given the harshest punishment of all in that Black Codes document, and I want you to think about why. So the second part of Reconstruction is radical Reconstruction, also known as Congressional Reconstruction. Northerners look at what's going on in the South, and they begin to wonder what the war was fought for. So they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It grants citizenship and civil liberties, and Congress, most importantly, defines freedom. It guarantees citizenship to blacks, so all people born in the U.S., except, ironically enough, Native Americans, are U.S. citizens. It guarantees equal rights under the law. It says that it is the duty of the federal government to intervene within the states when necessary to enforce these rights. This is a revolutionary extension of federal power. So you've got federal troops occupying the South during Reconstruction, and now you've got the federal government promising to intervene to protect the civil rights of newly freed slaves. But Congress is afraid that the Civil Rights Act won't stick, and they want it to become part of the U.S. Constitution. And this is where we get the 14th Amendment, which you have assigned to read through that link on Blackboard for this week. So Congress was worried about the Civil Rights Act being thrown out by the Supreme Court, and that is why they made it the 14th Amendment. There was some belated punishment of Confederate leaders, so all people who had made an oath of allegiance to the U.S., the Army, the government office, etc., like people who had occupied the Army and government office before they split off into the Confederacy, once they joined the Confederacy, they were excluded from holding office after the end of the war. That was about 25,000 people. However, almost all of them were pardoned by 1870. Under the conditions of readmission to the Union, so in order to get back into the Union and have their representatives recognized, Southern states have to ratify the 14th Amendment. So imagine that. We talked in part 1 about the Corwin Amendment possibly being the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, right? And that would have constitutionally permitted slavery in the states that existed. And now, in order to get back into the Union, these former Confederate states have to ratify the 14th Amendment, which grants citizenship and equal protection to these newly freed slaves. So remember that Johnson pardoned 13,000 Confederates, and this is considered, especially by Republicans in Congress, as a mockery of justice. So in reaction to this, Congress impeaches Andrew Johnson, but they do not remove him. He's not convicted. The Republicans who joined with the Democrats to vote for acquittal didn't believe in using impeachment as a political weapon, which is something that we see again in the 1990s, which we will get to later in this semester. So as we continue Reconstruction, I want to talk a little bit more about the meaning of freedom. And there is, we talked about the KKK, that's 1868 in Tennessee. So let's talk about, here's a political cartoon, let's talk about former slaves and some of their experiences. Ex-slaves hold older conceptions of freedom. Northern whites try to convince slaves that freedom of contract and self-ownership are freedom. Okay, so we just talked about republicanism and the idea of contract freedom and the ability to buy and sell labor, right? So Northern whites, Republicans especially, are trying to convince former slaves that freedom of contract and self-ownership are indeed freedom. However, most freed slaves continued to hold to older conceptions of freedom, like the older Republican Jeffersonian conception that emphasized a control of property and independence. Ex-slaves and some Republican leaders, including Thaddeus Stevens, believed that economic independence, meaning land ownership, is freedom. Stevens and many slaves argued that slave owners' estates should be broken up and they should get 40 acres and a mule as a share of the work they did in slavery. In fact, and I was just talking about this a bit ago, a group of former slaves petitioned President Andrew Johnson to keep land they had been given that belonged to Confederate slave owners in South Carolina. That was Special Field Order 15 that you read that was given out by Sherman. So we're going to listen to an audio clip of that petition, and I just want you guys to think about a couple of questions after we've listened to that.
We, the freedmen of Edisto Island, South Carolina, have learned from you through Major General O.O. Howard, with deep sorrow and painful hearts, of the possibility of the government restoring these lands to the former owners. Here is where secession was born and nurtured. Here is where we have toiled nearly all our lives as slaves and treated like dumb-driven cattle. This is our home, We have made these lands what they were. We are the only true and loyal people that were found in possession of these lands. We have been always ready to strike for liberty and humanity, yea, to fight if need be to preserve the glorious Union. Yea, to fight if need be to preserve this glorious Union. Shall not we who are freedmen, and have always been true to this Union, have the same rights as are enjoyed by others? Are not our rights as a free people and good citizens of these United States to be considered before those who were found in rebellion against this good and just government? Are we who have been abused and oppressed for many long years not to be allowed the privilege of purchasing land, but be subject to the will of these large landowners? God forbid. Land monopoly is injurious to the advancement of the course of freedom, and if government does not make some provision by which we as freedmen can obtain a homestead, we have not bettered our condition. We look to you for protection and equal rights with the privilege of purchasing a homestead right here in the heart of South Carolina.
So now that we've listened to that clip, what does that mean that they petitioned the president? Let's think about that, right? They've now been given the 13th and 14th Amendments, so they have equal protection and they're citizens. And one of the things that is great about being a citizen in the United States is the right to petition under the First Amendment. So they're exercising their citizenship rights there. They're attempting to preserve their idea of freedom, right? Property ownership and economic independence. So former slaves critique contractual freedom. And they realize that if all they have is their labor, they have no more choice about whether or not to work than if they were slaves. If all you have is your labor, you either work or you starve. Planters set up contracts that reinstated many of the old aspects of slavery. During slavery, slaves couldn't leave the plantation without permission. They had to submit to punishment. They had to work in gangs. Some of these things end up reinstated in these contracts with planters. Former slaves realize that they're going to end up working for their former masters, picking cotton again. They seek the best deal they can that will still allow them the chance to own land. And in the next part of the video, we're going to talk about what freedom meant to these ex-slaves.